Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Hour of the Basilisk, Part 2, by Bear Lair 64. Captain Papadopoulos had charge of the night phone at the police department. It had a mobile transfer system, but someone had to be there at the nerve center of the department, at least in his mind. The dispatch office down the hall enclosed the employees who worked in the communication hub. He considered himself the central figure. There'd been some personal issues in that hub, and he wanted to be there to keep an eye on them. He screened calls on his radio. He had a habit of charging out to any call that he felt that the supervisors and officers would not be able to handle without him. He was a little rattled by the death of the evidence tech and felt a need to be on hand, just in case. He didn't buy the story about toxins. He'd read about how certain drugs and drug components could penetrate the skin and cause death. She had likely been careless in her handling of some illicit substance. What was that? He paused in his contemplation, and in the absent-minded manner in which he'd been playing a video game on the city's computer. He'd felt some odd stir in the air and looked around for the source. Nothing. As he prepared to resume his game, he felt a tug at the back of his mind, a desire to look over the front edge of the patrol office desk. An odd, musky odor emanated from that area. Probably a stale mop. Stupid cleaning crew, he thought as he rose to peer over the edge and assuage his curiosity. Those eyes, those blazing pits of golden flame, they locked his gaze and showed him the depths of terror that resided within them and within his own, soon shattered and fading psyche. A later review of the surveillance recording may have shown a shadow that slithered through the lobby doors alongside a departing employee at the end of the late-night shift change. August 13th, 1969. I stayed away from my home for as long as I could manage. I needed fresh clothes, at a minimum, and frankly, I wanted to resume control of my personal space, my individual realm. I couldn't hide from the situation forever. I stalked through the house by using a mirror to check around every corner and to look into the tight spaces before I entered. I had a strategy, but it would take time. I picked up several items I needed and gathered some clothing. As I picked up the small suitcase, I heard the crash of a delicate object as it struck a hard surface. I was startled and dismayed. I know that it was something from my mantel, likely a ceramic piece from my childhood, the little statue of the Blessed Mother that my grandmother had gifted me. For all the grief of losing it, the sound of the shattering icon saved my life. I'd grown careless and failed to use the mirror. Yet the noise, while it startled me, drew my gaze instantly to the floor beside my right foot, rather than to the fireplace. I employed my little hand mirror, and there it was, coiled just in front of the screen for the hearth, the golden eyes shimmering in anger and frustration, and then faded into a blank reptilian stare. I felt the tug at the edge of my mind, much more intensely than the previous incident, but managed to resist. I tore away my consciousness and fled my home once more. Everett flipped to the photo, paper-clipped to the next page. It was of a cage with a trio of weasels. The caption at the bottom read, "Herbert, Winnie, and Dot, my soldiers." There were no fresh entries until August 15th, 1969. I was finally able to locate the best options available. 1. Several crates of mirrors to place all over the house. 2. Weasels or similar creatures were the only true predators for the basilisk. Our lab had some, and I needed them more than did the animal behaviorists. I entered the front door and used the hand mirror to check the entrance before I picked up the cage and carried it into the front room. I lifted the gate and released the 3 wiry bits of fur, muscle, and teeth to go about their hunt. They quickly scampered away from me and disappeared into the darkness of the interior of the house. I used the mirror to make my way to the second bedroom, which I'd converted into an office. It was the master bedroom, but I used it for a home office, since it was bigger than the space I used for sleeping. It contained a wall safe, which was part of my plan. I placed the original container from which the creature had arisen against the wall, just under the safe, and arranged the door so that I could drop it with a string. I will admit that it was a little silly with such a dangerous serpent, but I had great hopes that my allies would drive the beast into its familiar lair, or better yet, slay it for me. I took my place seated on the floor on the other side of my desk. I had set up a mirror against the wall so that I could peer at the doorway and see anything that might enter the room. It appeared shortly. I don't mean that I watched it slither and coil. It simply appeared. It coiled at the threshold and raised its head, and those eyes. It no doubt knew of my presence. It glided forward, its revolting body undulating closer to me. I thought I was doomed, but then, like tiny warriors, I heard the chittering squeaks of my 3 best friends. The basilisk whirled to face the threat, and a battle ensued in my home office room. The serpent indeed spat and struck out at each of the attackers, until both Herbert and Winnie had suffered mortal wounds. Perhaps it had venom after all, but as it struck down the larger Herbert, little Dot managed to take hold of the thing by the base of its skull, just below its crown, and drag it towards the ancient chest. Odd that she should know what to do, but perhaps it was some instinct to force the creature into a confined space. In any case, once both were inside the trap, I sprang it. I ensured that the lock was engaged, and then set about installing mirrors to cover every angle in the house, just in case. August 16th, 1969. I pressed the combination to lock the lid and lift the chest to the level of the wall safe, and then opened the sliding door once more. I felt the weight shift, then lift, as at least one large creature left it, along with a portion of the glittering dust that puffed through the unsealed connection between the chest and the safe. I dropped the valuable container and slammed the door of the safe closed. I caught a glimpse of one eye as the thing whipped its head towards me. I instantly fell ill as I engaged the latch on the safe, but did not have the presence of mind to spin the dial and lock it. I was incredibly weak and nauseous. I vomited onto the floor of my office. After a moment spent struggling to rise from my hands and knees, I checked the chest, which had landed on its base. Alas, the tiny, heroic corpse of Dot rested inside. I added the remains of her little band of fighters and closed the lid. I saw that most of the glittering dust remained within the small tomb and considered it a fitting decoration for the ferocious little warriors. I spent the rest of the night boxing up the material from the crates that Ikov had sent and loaded them to take to the university. It took every ounce of my strength, but I couldn't abide the thought of anything from those crates sitting in my home. August 17th, 1969. I've grown increasingly sickly and weak all day, as though some poison coursed through my system. I'm experiencing waking nightmares of a ball of golden flame, like looking into an infant son born here on Earth. With the help of some student interns, I managed to get the contents of the crate safely stored in the basement, among other, more mundane items. I picked up the rest of the weasels at the lab. Haven't named them yet, but they are freely roaming the house. I've made this entry, and I fear it may be my last. As I sit, hungry, thirsty, and weak, I stare at the wall safe, and I am once more drawn to it. I'll place the journal inside a nice, mirrored box to protect it, and provide an instant means of defense should anyone find it and seek the contents of my wall safe at some time. Hopefully they will open the mirrored box first. Everett closed the journal and set it on his own homework desk. It was indeed the last entry. No doubt the man had perished. Yet, what of the freaky tale? Why would a man make up such a story? It was no challenge to do some internet research. He found that there was indeed a Professor Halsey who worked at the university, and there was a note that the man had died of unlisted causes. He was able to search his own company records to find the list of known previous owners of the house at 79 Elder Street. There he was. A relative had claimed the property after his death and used it as a rental property until she too died. The property eventually reverted to the city and county for unpaid taxes. It had remained in lost litigation for 2 decades. He sighed and rubbed his head with his hands. He'd already looked through the boxes and crates. There was nothing ancient in any of them. No artifacts of a lost world or lost tomb. Besides, he was no archaeologist. Just a working stiff who'd done well and promoted. He considered contacting Detective Holmes, but quickly discarded the idea. He'll want to know why I didn't surrender the journal. Still, there was a dead technician at the police department and a potentially dangerous animal. He refused to think of it as some ghost monster on the loose. He heard the doorbell and the voice of his wife as she greeted visitors. More officials. This time they were with the health department, and he soon found himself in a university hospital facility, quarantined, along with several members of the police department. They were there for extensive tests to determine if there was a disease or toxin loose in the community. His wife and kids were on home lockdown in case of secondary infection. As he lay waiting for sleep to take him, he looked through the sealed window of the room that looked out over the adjacent campus. I wonder if anyone ever looked in that basement. Too bad he didn't say what building. And that was his last thought before sleep claimed him. Charity put away her cleaning bucket and mop. It had been a long shift, but at last the building was clean. She had stepped out into the hallway to go log her time out for the night when she heard a rustling, slithering sound. She felt a sudden urge to walk towards the dark end of the basement hallway, towards the old storage area that no one liked to visit. The staff who worked in this area swore that it was haunted, that there were cold spots, unexplained feelings of dread, and doors that opened and closed on their own. The cleaning and maintenance crews did their best to keep the hallway clean, but no one actually entered the several doorways at the end of the hallway. Rumor was that the university would soon clean out the facilities and explore using it as lab space, or more likely storage for newer items. Academic management was a slow process, so she had no idea when or if it would happen. As she completed the rambling thoughts, she found herself in front of the last door on the right, her keys in her hand and ready to the task. The key for this door stood out since it was shiny and unused. She inserted it in the lock and turned it. The lock struck for a moment and then disengaged. She turned the handle downward and pushed. Dust bunnies swirled away from the entrance, and a musty odor attacked her sinuses. The interior was as dark as a cavern. She stood, staring for a moment, listening as an awful hiss joined the scrapes of slithering scales. She barely registered the long body that slithered through the now open door. Once it was clear and hidden in the interior shadows, she removed a small plastic doorstop from her pocket. She always carried it and used them to prop doors for airflow when she mopped. She wedged the piece under the door so that it remained open very slightly, but unnoticeably in the murky corridor. When she left for home, it was with an unexpected sense of accomplishment, an almost giddy feeling that she had served her purposes well. Well, Mr. Manning, so far we haven't found any toxins or illnesses, but it will take some time. We are sending lab samples to the CDC National Facility and the WOH facilities. Dr. Wu passed on her latest update and gave her odd smile that, behind the mask and shield that covered her face, tugged at the small scar on her cheek. Everett had started to mentally refer to her as the sinister Dr. Wu, like some sci-fi horror story. Thank you, Doctor. The facilities are fine. I get to talk with my family every day on the laptop, and my boss has allowed me a leave of absence for as long as necessary. I truly appreciate how nice everyone has been. Dr. Wu's smile widened even further, and Everett imagined her mouth gaping with sharpened fangs. Maybe I've been here too long after all. My imagination is working overtime, he thought. As she turned to leave, he asked, Say, Doc, do you know about any old storage facilities on campus? Maybe for the archaeology department? She paused and looked over her shoulder. That department is pretty small these days. It will likely be shut down soon. We've transitioned to more research and social advocacy programs in the past 2 decades. Not much room for outdated sciences. She resumed her exit process, and he was left alone, his puzzle still left unsolved. Denny completed the puzzle and opened the lid of the beautiful antique chest. He sneezed and coughed for a moment and then felt a strong sense of urgency to leave. Forget about the container and get back to the changing light bulbs on the basement level. He all but fled the room, using his small flashlight to guide him. For some reason, he hadn't wanted to turn on the lights in the storage area. The thought crossed his mind that they may not work anyway. I don't think anyone's been back here in 28 years at the university. When he reached the doorway, he paused to carefully replace the doorstop, as it had been when he entered the room, when he'd been called. He glanced up just before he set the door in place, and for a split second, not even long enough to register in his conscious mind, he caught sight of a fiery golden eye. He turned and vomited onto the corridor floor. He felt weak and terribly frightened. In that momentary glimpse of the eye, he'd been pulled into a world of fire and fear, of frightening figures that danced and poked at him, and delighted at the screams he uttered. His supervisor found him there, huddled in the sweat and vomit-soaked mess, shaking, eyes bloodshot and staring from the sockets, clearly in abject and ongoing terror. Good thing the hospital's just a couple of buildings away from the science building. You think this one may survive, Doc? Detective Holmes asked. Dr. Wu shrugged. Don't know. He's pretty sick and has a high fever. It's like he was poisoned. We have him in an ICU quarantine room in the ward next to your other friend, Mr. Manning. Not that they have any contact. Holmes nodded. Sure hope you guys can figure out what's happening with this toxin or disease or whatever. This is the first one we found alive. Maybe it's not the same thing. It feels random, like a sickness or poison. Yet at the same time there are patterns. A trail, if you will. He shook himself and realized that he'd been speculating aloud, a habit from working solo for most of his career. Thank you, Doctor. Please give both your patients my regards when you're able. Everett shook in fear and tossed and turned in a nightmare-ridden attempt at rest. The dreams always featured molten golden eyes that blazed at him in fury. Eyes that knew that he had studied the old journal, that knew that he was aware that the eyes existed, that waited in the dark to feed on the energy generated by human fear. The next time he awakened, he gave up trying to sleep and went back to researching ancient Greek monsters and local news on his little laptop with the limited access. The university blocked many sites that he may have found useful, especially news sites. He would need to get out of this place soon. He'd been unable to locate anything else of use online. It was time to do some old-fashioned, in-person research. He especially wanted to see if the basement's storage was still intact. Hard to believe that it would be after so long, but it was worth a try. Then he had a thought. The campus community site had mentioned that the university board wanted to clear out and reclaim the space in the science building. Maybe they could use Lucan Reclamation Company as a contractor. It would give me a sales commission and satisfy my curiosity. With poor Leon gone, I could reasonably step in to directly supervise the operation. He switched over to email and got to work. I'll be the first to open that chest since 1969, and the second since Alexander the Great's time, he thought excitedly. Everett had asked the maintenance supervisor to have all of the light bulbs in the basement changed so that he and his crew could safely and efficiently remove and catalog the items in storage. It would be up to college officials to determine what to do with each item. He had been released from quarantine when the deaths and illnesses had stopped, and he showed no signs of having anything contagious. Detective Holmes had mentioned something about shiny particles that the lab reported as having some interesting qualities. Everett could not have cared less about lab work. He was a treasure hunter at heart, always curious and willing to take chances. Still, he'd brought along a small mirror. Deluded or not, the old guy who last had this stuff was a professor and likely fairly bright. As they approached the door in the now brightly lit basement corridor, their guide, a maintenance employee named Denny, indicated that the 3 doors at the end of the hallway were the storage areas included in the contract. I'll need to unlock these doors, and I hope you'll understand that either Dr. Carlyle or his assistant will have to be present during the cataloging process. He should be here soon. Denny opened the doors on the left and center, but paused and simply stood staring at the last door, the one on the right. He'd assumed a slack-jaw expression, and his arm dropped to either side in his stupor. At that moment, they heard shuffling footsteps approach from up the corridor. "I'll be there in a moment. Don't get started without me," called Professor Carlyle. He was accompanied by a middle-aged woman who smiled and remained silent. After introductions and pleasantries, Dr. Carlyle opened the door to the left and stood in the threshold for a moment. "I haven't been down here in years. There's many artifacts that may be of great value, and many pieces that are mostly, junk. Most of the latter is stored across the hallway in room B23. He was interrupted when Denny slumped to the floor, his eyes bulging and red, a look of horror frozen forever on his features. The members of the group rushed to his side, while Everett thought, "Here we go again. Why am I always present when people fall dead?" During the ensuing chaos, Everett noted that the door in front of which Denny had stood was cracked open, not locked at all. I should probably let the professor know, but something tells me this is it. The treasure room. I don't care what he said about it being full of junk. His defiant thoughts led him to send the rest of the team home for the day. We won't get anything done with all the reports, and I think that the professor and his assistants are still in too much shock to help. Let's try again tomorrow. We'll start later, about 1 o'clock. The crew members were happy enough to oblige. They'd spent most of a workday answering questions by campus police and some local detective. Either way, they would get paid. Everett knew that there was no cameras in the corridor, since there was no classrooms to monitor. It was well lit, though he wasn't sure what he'd find in the junk room, so he carried his big flashlight in addition to his mirror. He paused at room B23 and listened. It was all quiet, not even the sound of dust settling. He nervously chuckled as he pushed the door open. It whined a little in protest, but there was no horror movie squeal. The interior was dark, so he fished around on the inside wall for a light switch. "No way poor old Denny took care of it," he mumbled. Yet when his fingers found the switch and flipped it upward, there was light. New fluorescent bulbs in old sockets blinked in fittings and starts, but eventually settled into rows of humming luminescence. Everett was pleasantly surprised. He paused for a moment and used the mirror to check the corners just inside the room. There was nothing in the reflections, and he immediately felt foolish. Just nerves again, after all. I saw a man literally drop dead today. He still felt the need for some caution, and slowly and quietly as he could, he walked in and started to examine the contents of the mysterious room. It was pretty large, and there was shelving in the back portion that cast gloom despite the bright lighting. In the front were numerous pieces of furniture, some of it quite nice, but out of style. He considered the value of some of the pieces as antiques, but he was anxious to get back to the shelves. He knew if there was anything of value in this room, it would be in those shadowy stacks. It took several moments and the use of his flashlight, but he located a crate with letters that he recognized as foreign, maybe Greek. This is it. At least one of those crates is real. His mind leaped in anticipation. He found that the big box was sealed. He quickly located several more, and each looked sealed. Wait, that one by the back wall. It was not only unsealed, but the lid was removed, and the dust nearby was disturbed. He paused and looked at the floor. The heavy dust contained a set of footprints that approached and left the area, and a sinuous, winding track that would be made by a large reptile as it slithered forward. He stepped forward with an increasing sense of dread. The chest with the shining reflective stones rested inside the crate. The lid of the crate was slid open slightly. He used the mirror and the flashlight to check. It was empty, except for a portion of glittering dust that smelled rank. He looked around the storage room carefully, always using the mirror, but found nothing. The serpent had left its lair to hide among the detritus of boxes and crates and old furniture. Perhaps it had gone to hunt for food. Everett made a snap decision and bent to retrieve the chest full of glittering dust. He rushed from the room and carefully closed the door behind him. He swore that as he exited, he heard a snarling hiss and the scrape of scales. He immediately felt an intense need to reopen the door and re-enter room B23. Yet he resisted and fled as quickly as he could with his burden towards the safety of the stairwell and the fresh air and sunlight that would dispel the dark thoughts that attacked his psyche. He spent the next morning at the storage facility looking for an item he remembered from another job, then loaded it and drove back over to 79 Elder Street. He wanted to try an experiment and hoped desperately that it would work. The site was now no more than a concrete pad. The home with the tragic story of the archaeologist was now gone, other than the concrete slab with a few pipes and fixtures openings. Yet he had the feeling that perhaps there was lingering life in the area. He pulled a large box from the back of his vehicle and set it on the pad. He carefully removed a plastic sealed bag from his pocket and emptied its contents into the plastic box with the metal cage on the front. Now he'd have to step back and wait. He came back shortly after sunset and found that his trap had been sprung as intended. He waited until it was full and activated a remote switch to close it. It was an expensive setup retrieved from a live trapping enthusiast's hoard. Early the next morning, he drove to the university with his big box and the ancient chest. He found that the outer door was unlocked and made his way to the basement level. He first set the chest outside of B23 and returned shortly with the larger box that contained an angry, chittering mass of sleek, furred bodies. There were 5 of the creatures. He'd hoped that something about the dust, the smell of it, would lure them and keep them there. He'd taken the chest so that the basilisk would not have its lair. He suspected that something about the glittering dust preserved and sustained it. Perhaps a couple of days without it will have weakened the creature. He had closed the door to B23, but had disengaged the old-fashioned lock so he could again access the room. The corridor was as quiet as a tomb. He shuddered at the thought. He had expected the assault on his mind to begin immediately, but it had not. He felt nothing. No presence, not even foreboding. He worried that the serpent may have escaped. It may even now be wandering the hallways of the science building. Yet he noted that his team of small warriors were also quiet. Tensed, perhaps angry or scared, but definitely prepared to act. He placed the box near the entrance of the door and opened it slightly, then lifted the trap gate. The weasel sat for a moment, peering ahead, and then, with the largest leading the way, plunged headlong into the room with their war cries of "Chitter-cheet" that drowned out the scratching of their clawed feet as they slinked ahead to engage their most ancient foe. Everett, mirror in hand, followed them into the crowded room. He'd left the lights activated so he could see, though the items and shelves cast numerous deep shadows around the space offered numerous places from which an ambush could be sprung. In his other hand he carried another item from a different storage bin. It was a machete. It was one of the extra-long models, and the plastic handle had been replaced by one of polished bone. It looked piratical and sinister, and he had assumed that it would make short work even of a legend, a type of dragon. Then he felt the sudden onslaught at the corner of his consciousness, the urge to lower the mirror and turn to his right, to stare ahead. He shook himself and instead swept the blade in that direction. He could not see his target, but he felt its presence. He knew that it would be near, close enough to overwhelm his resolve. As the blade swished through the air with a slight whistle, he felt a momentary tug along the edge and heard a distinctive tink. He checked the hand mirror and saw a head rise, a head with a red crown. I missed, he thought, and even as he began to lunge away, the mouth of the reptile dropped open in preparation to attack. The miniature pounding of 24 little feet sounded with 6 screeches. The weasels sprung their own trap. That afternoon, Professor Carlyle lifted the lid from a crate and found a magnificent chest. He halted the activities of the reclamation crew to examine the find. No one noted that the dust around the crate had been stirred and moved significantly. The decrepit professor later published an article about the findings in the old storage room. It was an academic sensation, especially the chest that contained the odd glittering dust and the statue of a large serpent made from the coils of jet, with exquisite amber eyes and a crown of rubies. The only signs of damage or wear were a few chips in the crown and a large section of jet that was missing from the throat. Everett released his new friends outside of his own home. He hoped that they would stay in the area and do their useful natural work. Apparently, what had been needed was a larger team. Instead of 3 warriors, 6 had been sent. 2 still lived. They had dived in, bitten and dislodged, and striking and spitting of their adversary. Eventually the big one had been able to seize the basilisk's throat, just below the head. He sunk in his fangs and held, despite the thrashing of the serpent. Eventually it flung him loose, with a large chunk of its own throat still clamped in his jaws. At that point, the mighty creature of myth slunk to the floor and coiled. Unlike other snakes, it did not twitch, but still and ossified into the treasure Professor Carlyle later found. The 2 surviving heroes bounded from the cage and ran out about 20 feet, then paused, looked hard at Everett, their dark eyes glinting stonily at their captor. The large male rose on its hind legs and declared, and then dropped to all fours and slinked into the trees beside his mate. Babylon, June, 323, before Common Era. Can you feel the pattern on the armor? Telikos Strategos, the ultimate general, inquired. It is some of the most magnificent we have made for any of our adjuncts. I know that you cannot see, but I wish to honor you. I have also made for you a chest in which to hold your charge when it is not in the war box. A more comfortable place so the creature may rest beside you. The mirrors are on the outside. It seems to take comfort in your presence. Perhaps because you keep your other charges, the weasel pack, at bay. Though the adjunct could not see him, the Telikos Strategos smiled. He was nervous around this man, Koinos, who could not see, yet controlled the most effective weapon he possessed, one which had to be employed sparingly and judiciously, Least it be unleashed in the wrong company. Delios Stragigos, my eternal gratitude that you would wish to protect so humble a servant. The blind man sincerely expressed his appreciation. No one had cared much about him until he had inherited the creature of folklore that had been alive since at least the time of Achilles, and was rumored to have been part of the hero's legacy. It seemed to like the nest of glittering dust that the previous owner had told him had preserved the creature through the ages. As long as he kept it well fed and surrounded by a brace of undulating little mammals with ferocious attitudes, it refrained from spitting at or biting him. He had no need to fear the eyes. As the great general started to leave the apartment, he paused for a moment in thought. Now that his major campaigns were complete, he would need to eliminate some of his ambitious rivals, men of war rather than governance. As he stood considering, the adjutant opened the new chest and ushered his charge from the larger, more complex container into it. Magos Alexandros caught just the barest glimpse of a molten golden eye before the beast slid into its new chamber, and he became ill even as he entered the corridor. So quoth this raven. A huge thank you to Bear for his wonderful stories. I absolutely love folklore, as you all know, and Bear is always good at supplying that. And thank you all for listening. You guys are so awesome. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.